everyone. This video is to complete the second half of Hammer versus Dagenhart. We just left off with Champion versus Ames. Here's another one of the key precedents that the court has to grapple with here in Hammer, and that is Hippolyte Egg versus the United States. And this was a challenge to one of President Teddy Roosevelt's signature accomplishments. It was the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's what eventually became the Food and Drug Administration. And one of its provisions, specifically the one that was challenged, was it prohibited the interstate transportation of unlawful food or drugs. This is a time early in the 20th century when, people were bottling up snake oil and saying that it would cure cancer when it wouldn't. They were, trying to preserve meat, to last longer, but by injecting it with all kinds of harmful chemicals for people. And so the federal government wanted to sort of shut this stuff down. And again, just like in Champion versus Ames, there was a problem with holdout states. Were there states that were trying to crack down on this? Absolutely. But the problem is, now that we have railways, it's really easy to ship goods from a state that isn't as thorough about inspecting food and drugs. That stuff can be shipped across the country into a state that has really tough laws on these kinds of issues. And then the last two cases, Hoke versus United States upheld the Mann Act, which is also known as the White Slave Traffic Act. The goal of the law was to prohibit the interstate transportation of sex workers. Why did this law need to get passed? It was basically Congress got worked up in a fit of hysteria about white women being kidnapped and forced into becoming sex workers, and it wasn't really true. But Congress decided to pass this law anyways. And then finally, Clark Distilling versus Western Maryland Railway Company involved a federal ban on the interstate transportation of booze. And as you will recall from Mugler versus Kansas, some states wanted to ban booze, and they can easily do that when it comes to preventing booze being manufactured in their state. But once other states get involved, it becomes a lot trickier. And so, again, to help states like Kansas enforce their laws, not allowing booze, Congress got involved and said, okay, Kansas can shut down all the breweries in its state and all the distilleries. But to make sure that they don't have to worry about booze being shipped in from other states, we're going to pass this law. And the court upheld that one too. So again, holdout states, states can ban prostitution, but they can't prevent its citizens from traveling across state lines to seek it out. States can ban the sale of booze, but it's hard to be effective if out-of-state booze sneaks in, right? So all four of these cases address different issues involving, potential problems of health, safety, welfare, and morality, which is usually not something that the federal government can address. But in these instances, because they all involve interstate commercial transactions, Congress chose to get involved. And part of the reason why was to make sure that all states have a chance to have their laws enforced effectively. So where do we encounter the problem of holdout states and child labor? Well, this was much a fight about economics and regionalism as it was about standards of morality. And so neither one of these, most but not all northern states had restricted child labor, and most but not all southern states allowed child labor. And goods, this was necessary because the Industrial Revolution had really taken off in the North, but not in the South, because after the Civil War, the South was so busy just repairing things that were destroyed by the war that they couldn't catch up. So the way they chose to catch up instead wasn't through technology, trying to match Northern technology, but instead make sure that you could keep the prices of goods cheap by making sure that labor was cheap. And so who ends up getting paid less? Well, it's labor done by women, people of color, and children. And, this, again, if you're thinking, oh, this sounds kind of similar to the four cases we just discussed, Justice Holmes, who ends up writing a dissent, would definitely agree with you. And yet, the majority opinion tries to go out of its way to say we were right to uphold those laws for lottery tickets, unsafe food and drinks, sex workers, and booze, but it would be wrong to uphold the Child Labor Act. Oh, okay, why? All right, that seems like a heck of a move to make. How do you make sense of that? Well, what the court says, what Justice Day says, is lottery tickets were inherently harmful. Unsafe food and drinks, inherently harmful, right? Sex work, from a moral standpoint, at least according to a particular set of moral values, is inherently harmful, and booze can be thought of as inherently harmful. However, Mr. Dagenhart's son is working in a cotton mill, and you can't tell any difference between cotton that was produced by adults and cotton produced by children, right? Cotton is cotton. And so it's these four cases really were about solving a commercial problem, preventing harmful goods from spreading across the country. So, of course, the court was right to do this in these four cases. But the only reason, if you're not concerned about the quality of the cotton, then the only reason Congress is getting involved is because it's upset by child labor. And the only level of government that is supposed to be in charge of labor is the states, because labor takes place in one factory located in one state. Then what does Day say about this, unfair competition, like the South is being sort of the holdout states? And he says, well, the Child Labor Act isn't the answer. Because you can't just, let the federal government take over and just say, we know better than North Carolina when it comes to labor policy. That's not the way the Constitution was designed. Because once you allow it here, then, what's going to stop Congress? The power of state governments will be eliminated over the long run. That's what Days says. Oliver Wendell Holmes disagrees, and once again, he's a little grumpy about it, right? And so his basic premise is no, wait a second. Congress is in charge, and the job of judges is not to question whether Congress is doing something smart or dumb. It's not the job of a court to decide what Congress's motivation was. The only thing that courts are in charge of is to look at the way the law works and determine whether it's a valid regulation of commerce. And, because Congress is in charge of commerce, and that power is in unqualified terms, right? So long as it's interstate. And, we've joked about Holmes being grumpy, but, he actually sort of does this thing where he's like, well, wait a second. Some people might like lottery tickets and think there's nothing harmful with them. Some people might like, booze and sex workers and not think it's any problem. But surely no matter where we live, north or south, no matter what sort of, moral values we have, shouldn't we all sort of believe in the fact that child labor is a huge moral problem? That, Congress has the authority to nip in the bud because child labor ends up producing goods that will be sold in interstate commerce. And so if you regulate the goods that kids produce, isn't it a good thing that a consequence of that is that children get treated better? So Holmes obviously ends up losing in this case, but we'll see later on in the semester where this perspective goes from being in the minority to being in the majority. So what kinds of things should you be focusing on? What kinds of things might I be asking for a short answer question? One is, how does the court distinguish Hammer from the four previous cases? Do you need to know the names of the four previous cases? No. In fact, if you can just even describe two of them, there was the booze case and there was the lottery tickets case, you're going to be just fine. The important thing isn't that you name all the stuff, is that be able to summarize the argument as to why, it was fine for Congress to pass a law in those four cases, but not to eliminate child labor. You need to be able to tell me that. And then, you need to be able to sort of understand why Holmes thought it was like a really useful argument to invoke John Marshall and sort of going back to Gibbons versus Ogden to, basically say, hey, if you think this is a dumb policy, if you think it was motivated for wrong, reasons, then elect different people to Congress, right? But don't go whining to the judges. The judges' job should only be to look at the way the law operates and not what motivated the politicians to pass it in the first place. So I hope this helps, and I will see you in class next time. Thanks.